Mental Efficiency and Other Hints to Men and Women by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 5. Marriage. The Duty of It. Every now and then it becomes necessary to deal faithfully with that immortal type of person, the praiser of the past at the expense of the present. I will not quote Horace, as by all the traditions of letters I ought to do, because Horace, like the incurable trimmer that he was, hedged on this question, and I do not admire him much either. The praiser of the past has been very rife lately. He has told us that pauperism and lunacy are mightily increasing, and though the exact opposite has been proved to be the case, and he has apologised, he will have forgotten the correction in a few months, and will break out again into renewed lamentation. He has told us that we are physically deteriorating, and in such awful tones that we have shuddered, and many of us have believed. And considering that the death rate is decreasing, that slums are decreasing, that disease is decreasing, that the agricultural labourer eats more than ever he did, our credence does not do much credit to our reasoning powers, does it? Of course, there is that terrible influx into the towns, but I, for one, should be much interested to know wherein the existence of the rustic in times past was healthier than the existence of the town dwellers of today. The personal appearance of agricultural veterans does not help me. They resemble starved bus drivers twisted out of shape by lightning. But the pièce de résistance of the praiser of the past is now marriage, with discreet hints about the birth rate. The praiser of the past is going to have a magnificent time with the subject of marriage. The first moanings of the tempest have already been heard. Bishops have looked askance at the birth rate, and have mentioned their displeasure. The matter is serious. As the phrase goes, it strikes at the root. We are marrying later, my friends. Some of us, in the hurry and preoccupation of business, are quite forgetting to marry. It is the duty of the citizen to marry and have children, and we are neglecting our duty. We are growing selfish. No longer are produced the glorious quiverfuls of old times. Our fathers married at 20. We marry at 35. Why? Because a gross and enervating luxury has overtaken us. What will become of England if this continues? There will be no England. Hence we must look to it, and so on in the same strain. I should like to ask all those who have raised and will raise such outcries, have you read X? Now, the book that I refer to as X is a mysterious work, written rather more than 100 years ago by an English curate. It is a classic of English science. Indeed, it is one of the great scientific books of the world. It has immensely influenced all the scientific thought of the 19th century, especially Darwin's. Mr. H.G. Wells, as cited in Chambers' Cyclopedia of English Literature, describes it as the most shattering book that ever has or will be written. If I may make a personal reference, I would say that it affected me more deeply than any other scientific book that I have read. Although it is perfectly easy to understand and free from the slightest technicality, it is the most misunderstood book in English literature, simply because it is not read. The current notion about it is utterly false. It might be a powerful instrument of education, general and sociological, but publishers will not reprint it. At least they do not. And yet it is 40 times more interesting and 400 times more educational than Gilbert White's remarks on the birds of Selborne. I will leave you to guess what X is, but I do not offer a prize for the solution of a problem which a vast number of my readers will certainly solve at once. If those who are worrying themselves about the change in our system of marriage would read X, they would probably cease from worrying, for they would perceive that they had been putting the cart before the horse, that they had elevated to the dignity of fundamental principles certain average rules of conduct which had sprung solely from certain average instincts in certain average conditions, and that they were now frightened because, the conditions having changed, the rules of conduct had changed with them. One of the truths that X makes clear is that conduct conforms to conditions and not conditions to conduct. The payment of taxes is a duty which the citizen owes to the state. Marriage, with the begetting of children, is not a duty which the citizen owes to the state. Marriage, with its consequences, is a matter of personal inclination and convenience. It never has been anything else, and it never will be anything else. How could it be otherwise? If a man goes against inclination and convenience in a matter where inclination is of the essence of the contract, he merely presents the state with a discontented citizen, if not two, in exchange for a contented one. The happiness of the state is the sum of the happiness of all its citizens. To decrease one's own happiness, then, is a singular way of doing one's duty to the state. Do you imagine that when people married early and much, they did so from a sense of duty to the state? A sense of duty which our modern luxury has weakened? I imagine they married simply because it suited them. They married from sheer selfishness, as all decent people do marry. And do those who clatter about the duty of marriage kiss the girls of their hearts with an eye to the general welfare? I can fancy them saying, "My angel, I love you," from a sense of duty to the state. Let us rear innumerable progeny from a sense of duty to the state. How charmed the girls would be. If the marrying age changes, if the birth rate shows a sympathetic tendency to follow the death rate, as it must, see X, no one need be alarmed. Elementary principles of right and wrong are not trembling on their bases. The human conscience is not silenced. The nation is not going to the dogs. Conduct is adjusting itself to new conditions, and that is all. We may not be able to see exactly how conditions are changing. That is a detail. Our descendants will see exactly. Meanwhile, the change in our conduct affords us some clue. And although certain nervous persons do get alarmed and do preach and do take measures, the rest of us may remain placid in the sure faith that measures will avail nothing whatever. If there are two things set high above legislation, movements, crusades, and preaching, one is the marrying age and the other is the birth rate. For there the supreme instinct comes along and stamps ruthlessly on all insincere reasonings and sham altruisms. Stamps on everything, in fact, and blandly remarks, "I shall suit my own convenience, and no one but nature herself, with a big, big N, shall talk to me. Don't pester me with right and wrong. I am right and wrong." Having thus attempted to clear the ground a little of fudge, I propose next to offer a few simple remarks on marriage. The adventure of it. Having endeavoured to show that men do not and should not marry from a sense of duty to the state or to mankind, but simply and solely from an egoistic inclination to marry, I now proceed to the individual case of the man who is in a position to marry, and whose affections are not employed. Of course, if he has fallen in love, unless he happens to be a person of extremely powerful will, he will not weigh the pros and cons of marriage. He will merely marry, and 40,000 cons will not prevent him. And he will be absolutely right and justified, just as the straw, as it rushes down the current, is absolutely right and justified. But the privilege of falling in love is not given to everybody, and the inestimable privilege of falling deeply in love is given to few. However, the man whom circumstances permit to marry, but who is not in love, or is only slightly amorous, will still think of marriage. How will he think of it? I will tell you. In the first place, if he has reached the age of 30 unscathed by Aphrodite, he will reflect that that peculiar feeling of romantic expectation with which he gets up every morning would cease to exist after marriage, and it is a highly agreeable feeling. In its stead, in moments of depression, he would have the feeling of having done something irremediable, of having definitely closed an avenue for the outlet of his individuality. Kindly remember that I am not describing what this human man ought to think. I am describing what he does think. In the second place, he will reflect that after marriage he could no longer expect the charming welcomes which bachelors so often receive from women. He would be done with as a possibility, and he does not relish the prospect of being done with as a possibility. Such considerations, all connected more or less with the loss of freedom, oh mysterious and thrilling word, will affect his theoretical attitude. And be it known that even the freedom to be lonely and melancholy is still freedom. Other ideas will suggest themselves. One morning, while brushing his hair, he will see a grey hair, and however young he may be, the anticipation of old age will come to him. A solitary old age. A senility dependent for its social and domestic requirements on condescending nephews and nieces, or even more distant relations. Awful, unthinkable. And his first movement, especially if he has read that terrible novel Fort comme la mort of de Maupassant, is to rush out into the street and propose to the first girl he encounters, in order to avoid this dreadful nightmare of a solitary old age. But before he has got as far as the doorstep, he reflects further. Suppose he marries, and after 20 years his wife dies, and leaves him a widower. He will still have a solitary old age, and a vastly more tragical one than if he had remained single. Marriage is not, therefore, a sure remedy for a solitary old age. It may intensify the evil. Children? But suppose he doesn't have any children. Suppose there being children, they die. What anguish! Suppose merely that they are seriously ill and recover. What an aging experience! Suppose they prove a disappointment. What endless regret!